Hey everybody, Steven Vargas here today. I'm a senior software engineer at Microsoft. I spent most of my career working in Azure and the cloud, and this is just my personal channel where we just kind of hang out like buddies talking about cloud technologies. This is not in any way associated with Microsoft. This is just things I do in my free time because I enjoy working with the cloud and I enjoy working with Azure specifically. So today I kind of want to talk a little bit about Azure Data Explorer. You might have not even heard of this. Even people working in the Azure ecosystem that have a lot of experience in the area are still sometimes lost on the purpose of Azure Data Explorer, what good use cases are for it, and just the general concept of what it is as a product. So today I'm going to be talking just very high level about what Azure Data Explorer is, kind of my experience with it, and kind of what I think is a good use case for this Azure product offering. To start off, if you go onto the Azure website and you read what they kind of describe as the purpose or what Azure Data Explorer is, you'll see they say Azure Data Explorer is a fast, fully managed data analytics service for real-time analysis of large volumes of data streaming from applications, websites, IoT devices, and more. So what does that mean really? And you kind of have to remember when these products are developed, they're usually developed by engineers or sometimes research, and there's a whole group of people working on these. But by the time it gets to being offered as a product, usually these descriptions are written up by marketers and people in sales, and they kind of write these up in a way to make it easily digestible by a customer. And this might not be the best way to understand it as like an engineer, or if you're someone that's actually building products with this. So I'm going to try to talk about this from the point of view of an engineer and not someone that's like necessarily trying to sell you on Azure Data Explorer. So the best way I would describe it is Azure Data Explorer is just another database technology. It's a database built on top of a cluster, so there's a bunch of different nodes within the Azure Data Explorer cluster, and it's really highly optimized for querying over pretty much anything else. And it supports all the normal database concepts that you're used to. It supports the databases, tables, and stored procedures, but in Azure Data Explorer you call it stored procedures functions, and they're pretty much read-only stored procedures. So when you're setting up an Azure Data Explorer, I'm going to refer to it as ADX going forward. When you're setting up an ADX cluster or database, the first thing you really do is you create a database, you ingest data into it, and then you query it. So pretty much the same way you operate with any other database. There's nothing really special about this. So there's a couple, I think, defining characteristics of Azure Data Explorer that kind of make it a little bit different than some other database technologies. The first one is it's a columnar data store. So that means data inside Azure Data Explorer for the most part is stored in columns versus like a SQL database where the data is stored horizontally in rows. So if you need, like, say you have a person table and you want like a person's age, and that's only a single column from a row in a SQL database, you're going to have to pull that whole row. So if that row is, I don't know, 25 columns wide, you're going to have to pull all that data in order just to get the age value. For Azure Data Explorer, since everything is stored in columns, you can have a table with 200 columns, and if you only need one value from any given rows, you can just pull that single column since it's stored in a column and not the entire row. You don't need to pull all 200 columns from that row. So that makes it pretty fast, and you can just select exactly which columns you need from any given table, and it will only use that data and only pull those columns into memory when you're querying this. So it makes it really fast, and you can have really giant tables with huge number of columns with little to no performance impact on querying. Next, there's the concept of cross-cluster queries. So what's nice about this is normally in SQL you can't really just like query across from one SQL server to like another SQL server and just join data and kind of have this like I wouldn't say transparent, but this like very low friction cross-cluster, cross-server querying experience. With Azure Data Explorer, you can query tables from any number of different clusters, and it's almost, as a customer, it kind of feels like you're just querying different tables within the same server or database. It really feels the same, and it has all these different optimizations that make it really fast, and it kind of tries to intelligently do the joins on the right cluster to get the right performance things, but for the most part, you don't have to move big sets of data around in order from cluster to cluster or server to server to do joins. So that's really nice, and depending on the use case, you can get away with just querying data from other servers and without having to ingest huge amounts of data or copy that data over first manually to your cluster. It's fairly well tested. It's used across Microsoft and across many different Fortune 500 companies, and it's the backbone of many kind of other products and services you use on Azure. Finally, Azure Data Explorer supports this concept of followers. So a follower is pretty much separate compute sitting on top of your underlying data. So say you have this production workload and it's a really useful data that other customers want to consume, and you're using this for your production scenario, so you don't want a customer to hit your data, hit your server, and potentially slow down your production endpoints. You can create a follower on top of that same data. You can expose that follower to your customers so they can compute, run queries and everything on top of your data, and they're not going to impact your compute and your performance for your production systems. So it's almost like a copy, read-only database and copy of your data, your underlying data in that database. So it's really nice. You can expose everything to customers without worrying about the impact on your production services. So some pros to Azure Data Explorer versus say like SQL. It has extremely fast query performance, especially when you're comparing dollar to dollar against SQL. The Kusto query language, the query language you use for Azure Data Explorer, is used across a ton of different Microsoft Azure products. So it's used within Azure Monitor, App Insights, Log Analytics, just a wide range of products. So if you learn Kusto query language, this kind of skill set is going to transfer to a lot of different Microsoft products. And like I mentioned, cross-cluster querying is really nice just because you don't have to worry about the whole data orchestration to move data over before you can do joins and things like that. You can just read directly from someone else's cluster, assuming they give you permission. And you can do those joins and queries and things like that without having to worry about the whole overhead of moving data around yourself. Some cons. For the most part, Azure Data Explorer is read-only. You can do deletes and updates if needed, but this is really more of an ad hoc thing and not something you would do as part of your normal data lifecycle, just because deletes and updates are very, very expensive operations in Azure Data Explorer. Another con is ingestion and inserts and things like that into Azure Data Explorer is a little bit more cumbersome than like a SQL database. It's like inserting single rows, doing single updates, since it's like I mentioned, it's read-only. Is not as simple as just SQL update this row value. So if you want to do like an update, for the most part, you would generally just ingest a new row with the updated data, and then you would select the row with the most recent updated data for any given key. So say you have a person, you want to update some information about them, you would just insert a new row with the same ID for that person with updated information, and then when you query it, you just make sure to have some column or something with like an updated date, and you would just select the most recent updated date for that person record. And finally, like I mentioned, there's not a whole lot of information out there about Azure Data Explorer. So when you run into issues, it can be a little bit hard to diagnose them just because you can't just go on Stack Overflow and see millions of different users and customers are using Azure Data Explorer and are experts in this technology. But that's why I'm here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I enjoy talking about Azure Data Explorer. So that's a really fast overview of Azure Data Explorer. And just to kind of wrap everything up and go over it one more time, Azure Data Explorer is just another database technology that is highly optimized for querying and not optimized so much for doing things like updates or deletes. For the most part, it's a read-only database. So if you have a workflow or data flow that kind of makes sense in that scenario where you're doing mostly inserts and you need really fast query performance, this is probably the best bang for your buck in terms of like Azure database technologies. It also works well for scenarios where you kind of have snapshots of data and every day that snapshot is completely refreshed, because in the case of Azure Data Explorer, you can just drop the whole table, re-ingest the whole table, and that's not really, there's no big performance impact to that. So individual row updates and deletes is kind of cumbersome, but deleting a whole table and ingesting a whole new data set every day is fairly common with Azure Data Explorer and a somewhat good use case for this. It also works well in scenarios where you have this huge data set that you want to expose to several different customers, and you don't want them to be necessarily like running into each other with their queries. So you can expose that data set through a bunch of different followers, create a follower for each customer so they all have their own compute, and they can all run whatever queries they want without kind of impacting each other's performance. So I hope this was like a somewhat useful introduction to Azure Data Explorer. Let me get a nice little thumbnail picture here. Alright, and hope everybody's doing well. If you have any questions, you want to talk more about Azure Data Explorer or other Azure technologies, feel free to reach out. I enjoy talking about this. Hope everybody's doing well, and I'll see you out there.